For the last time, Marcus, the merger is handled. Stop hovering. Julian Vance's voice was a low growl, a shard of ice in the overheated ballroom. He adjusted the cuff of his $1,000 shirt, his gaze sweeping over the glittering assembly of his city's elite with a boredom that bordered on contempt. They were all vultures in finer feathers, circling the colossal fortune his father had left him. At 29, he was the king of an empire he had inherited, not built, a fact that sat like a stone in his gut. Marcus Thorne, his perpetually sycophantic CO, merely smiled, his expression a mask of deference. Of course, Julian. It's just the optics. The Vanguard deal is fragile. A display of absolute control is paramount. Marcus gestured vaguely at the room, at the champagne flutes and saccharine laughter. Every detail matters. Even the service here tonight is a bit subpar, isn't it? Julian didn't care about the service. He cared about the gnawing emptiness that no acquisition or victory could fill. It had been a year since his father's death, a year of suffocating in boardrooms, of shaking hands with smiling sharks. He felt nothing but the crushing weight of a legacy he never asked for. His life was a gilded cage, and tonight, the bars felt especially cold and close. He was trapped, and Marcus's incessant buzzing was the fly he desperately wanted to swat. He just needed a target, a release for the pressurized rage that lived behind his ribs. A sudden commotion near the catering station drew their attention. A young waiter, no older than 20, stumbled, his tray of colorful cocktails tilting precariously. A woman in the simple, gray uniform of the custodial staff moved with surprising speed, her hands outstretched as if to ward off the disaster. But it was too late. The tray crashed to the polished marble floor. Glasses shattered. A rainbow of sticky liquid splashed across the pristine tiles, narrowly missing the silk gown of a senator's wife. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. Marcus clicked his tongue in theatrical disgust. You see? This is precisely what I mean. Incompetence. The woman, whose name tag read Elena, immediately knelt, her movements efficient and practiced as she began picking up the larger shards of glass. She ignored the stares, the whispers. Her focus was solely on the mess, a small island of chaos she was determined to restore to order. The young waiter was pale, stammering apologies. Marcus, however, advanced on Elena. You! What were you doing? Distracting him? You people are paid to be invisible, not to cause a scene. Elena looked up, her dark eyes calm but firm. She was a woman who had weathered storms far greater than a spilled drink. Sir, I was trying to help. The boy tripped. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried a weight of dignity that seemed to enrage Marcus further. He sneered. Excuses. I want your name. You'll be reported to your supervisor immediately. We can't have this sort of element at a function of this caliber. It was the final straw for Julian. The injustice, the noise, the sheer pathetic smallness of it all coalesced into a single point of unbearable pressure. This was the chaos Marcus had warned him about. This was the lack of control. He strode forward, his presence silencing the murmurs. What is the problem here? He demanded, his voice cutting through the air. Marcus turned, his demeanor shifting to one of righteous indignation. Julian, this janitor created this entire mess. A complete disruption. Elena rose to her feet, her hands holding a few sharp pieces of glass wrapped in a napkin. That is not true, sir. I was only— Julian didn't let her finish. He saw only the problem. The stain on the floor, the stain on his evening, the stain on his company's immaculate reputation. He saw a disruption that needed to be erased. I don't care what you were doing, he snapped, his voice dangerously low. You are finished. Get out. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, he saw not fear, but a profound disappointment that struck him more than any defiance could have. Sir, if you would just let me explain. He raised his hand, intending to wave her away, to dismiss her from his sight and his life. But in that moment of pure, unadulterated arrogance and rage, his control slipped. His hand, meant to be a gesture of dismissal, connected with her cheek. It wasn't a brutal strike, but it was unmistakable. A slap. The sound was sharp, ugly, and it echoed in the sudden, tomb-like silence of the ballroom. Every head turned. Every whisper died. In that single, irrevocable instant, Julian Vance, the billionaire titan of industry, had struck a janitor in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in the city. The shock on Elena's face was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. She did not cry out. She did not flinch away. She simply held his gaze, her eyes a mirror reflecting the ugliness of his own actions. And in her quiet, unbreakable dignity, Julian felt the first terrifying tremor of a world about to collapse. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life, a mistake that would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself, his empire, and the true meaning of power. The aftermath was a blur of frantic damage control. Marcus whisked him away to a private lounge, hissing about lawsuits and public relations disasters while Julian stared at his own hand, a faint tingling on his palm. The sting was nothing compared to the cold dread seeping into his bones. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was the chilling realization of his own impulsiveness, the exposure of a crack in his carefully constructed facade of control. By morning, the incident was a contained fire, thanks to a legion of lawyers and a hefty, non-disclosure-laced settlement paid to the cleaning contractor. The company had fired the woman, Elena Hayes, instantly. Her name was a footnote in a report on his desk, an issue that had been resolved, but it wasn't resolved. The image of her eyes, disappointed, not broken, was seared into his mind. He couldn't sleep. During a tense video conference about the Vanguard merger, he found himself staring out his penthouse window, seeing not the city skyline but her face. This wasn't about the PR. It was about something deeper, something that pricked at the calloused shell around his heart. He needed to understand, not just what happened, but who she was. Why hadn't she screamed? Why hadn't she fought back? He did something he hadn't done in years. He bypassed his entire executive apparatus and made a call to a private investigator he kept on a discreet retainer. "Find everything you can on a woman named Elena Hayes," he commanded. "Fired yesterday from Sterling Services. I want to know where she lives, her family situation, her history, everything. And I want it by tomorrow." The file that arrived the next day was thin, but its contents were heavy. Elena Hayes, 34, widowed. Her husband, a construction worker, had died 2 years prior in a workplace accident. She had one child, a 7-year-old daughter named Maya, and Maya was sick, a rare autoimmune disorder that required expensive medication and constant care. Elena worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, cleaning at night and working in a diner during the day. She had never missed a day of work. She had no complaints against her record. She was, by all accounts, a ghost, a person who moved through the world silently and diligently, asking for nothing. And he had tried to break her. Julian felt a wave of something unfamiliar and sickening wash over him. It was the bitter taste of shame. Throwing money at this wouldn't fix it. A settlement check to a faceless corporation did nothing for the woman he had publicly humiliated. He had to do more. He had to see it for himself. An idea, reckless and insane, began to form in his mind. He would not approach her as Julian Vance, the man who had wronged her. He would see her world from the inside. He would understand the life he had so carelessly disrupted. He made another call, this time to the head of Sterling Services, the contractor he technically owned through a dozen holding companies. "I'm sending a man to work at one of your downtown crews," Julian said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "His name is John Carter. He needs a job, no questions asked. Put him on the night shift. I want him to have the full experience." The next evening, Julian Vance, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, stood in a cramped supply closet, the smell of bleach and industrial soap stinging his nostrils. He was wearing a drab, gray uniform identical to the one Elena had worn. His hands, usually accustomed to the weight of a Mont Blanc pen, gripping the plastic handle of a mop. He was John Carter, the new janitor, and he was about to step into a world he never knew existed. He found her on the 24th floor of a rival corporate tower. He recognized her immediately, even from behind. The same quiet efficiency, the same focused grace in her movements as she wiped down a conference room table. He kept his head down, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like an imposter, a spy in the house of the honorable. His supervisor, a grizzled man named Sal, grunted at him. "You're with her tonight, Hayes. She'll show you the ropes. Don't slow her down. She's the best we've got." The irony was a physical blow. The woman his COO had called incompetent was considered the gold standard among her peers. Elena turned as he approached, her eyes briefly scanning his face before she gave a small, tired nod. There was no recognition. To her, he was just another weary soul trying to make it through the night. "You're John?" she asked, her voice soft. "I'm Elena. We have floors 24 through 28. We start with the offices, then the common areas, then the bathrooms. Sal likes the bathrooms to be spotless. He checks." She handed him a spray bottle and a stack of microfiber cloths. "Let's get started." For the next few hours he worked. Truly worked. He scrubbed toilets, emptied trash cans filled with half-eaten gourmet salads, and vacuumed endless corridors of plush carpeting. His muscles, accustomed to bespoke gym equipment, ached with a dull, unfamiliar burn. He saw the world from a different angle, a world of scuff marks, overflowing bins, and the casual disregard of the people who occupied these spaces during the day. And he watched Elena. He saw how she meticulously sorted recyclables from the trash, even though no one would have known the difference. He saw her find a wallet left on a desk and turn it in directly to the security guard, not even glancing at the cash inside. He saw her humming a soft lullaby to herself as she polished the glass doors, her reflection a fleeting, ghostly image against the glittering city lights. During their 10-minute break, they sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit break room. She unwrapped a simple sandwich, cut in half. She noticed him empty-handed. "You didn't bring anything?" He shook his head, feeling foolish. Forgot without a word. She pushed half of her sandwich across the table toward him. "Here," she said simply. "You can't work on an empty stomach." He stared at the offering. This woman, whom he had wronged so profoundly, who was struggling to pay for her daughter's medicine, was sharing her meager meal with a stranger. The simple act of kindness was more damning than any accusation. "I can't take your food," he mumbled, his throat tight. "It's just a sandwich," she said with a small, weary smile. "People have to look out for each other. It's all we've got." He took the sandwich, and the taste of cheap bread and turkey was a sacrament of his own disgrace. It was then that he noticed the small silver locket around her neck, tarnished with age. It seemed to be her only adornment, a stark contrast to the diamonds and platinum he was used to seeing. It was a symbol of a life lived, not a life purchased. The first twist of the knife came a few nights later. Sal pulled Elena aside, his voice a low, angry rumble. Julian, pretending to be cleaning a nearby cubicle, strained to hear. "Another complaint from Thorne's office at the Vance Tower," Sal hissed. "Says the executive washroom was unacceptable last week." "That was your section." Hayes. Elena's back stiffened. "But I cleaned it myself, Sal. I always do. It was perfect." "Well, Marcus Thorne says it wasn't. And what he says goes. This is the second complaint in a month. One more and I have to let you go. Corporate is breathing down my neck about efficiency scores." Elena's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. "I understand," she whispered. Julian felt a cold fury rise within him. Marcus. Of course it was Marcus. He was manufacturing complaints, creating a paper trail to justify her firing from the gala, covering his own tracks and likely trying to impress Julian with his tough-on-standards approach. He was systematically destroying this woman's livelihood over a spilled drink he had likely caused. The injustice was no longer a single, impulsive act. It was a deliberate, cruel campaign. He had to get closer to understand the full scope of it. The next night, he saw his chance. He found her in the break room again, her head in her hands. She wasn't crying, but a heavy aura of despair hung around her. He sat down cautiously, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Rough night?" he asked gently. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. She seemed to see him, really see him, for the first time. A fellow traveler in the lonely hours of the night. "It's my daughter, Maya," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The fever is back. The doctors want to try a new treatment, but the insurance company is refusing to cover it. They say it's experimental. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. Experimental. It's her only hope, and to them, it's a line item on a spreadsheet. He felt an urge to write a check, to solve the problem with the blunt instrument of his wealth. But he knew that wasn't the answer. That would be the old Julian's solution. John had to offer something else. I'm so sorry, he said, and the words felt inadequate, hollow. Is there anything I can do? She shook her head, but then she looked at him, a flicker of trust in her exhausted eyes. You can listen, she said. Sometimes that's enough, and so he listened. She spoke of her husband, David, a man who could build anything with his hands, but couldn't fight the faulty scaffolding that took his life. She spoke of Maya, a little girl who loved to draw but whose hands now trembled too much to hold a crayon. She told him about the fear that lived with her every second, the fear of a phone call from the hospital, the fear of an eviction notice, the fear of not being enough. As she spoke, she clutched the silver locket at her throat. This was my husband's, she said, her thumb tracing its worn surface. He gave it to me on our first anniversary. He said as long as I had it, I'd never be alone. She opened the clasp. On one side was a tiny, faded photograph of a smiling, handsome man. On the other was a picture of a little girl with bright, laughing eyes, Maya, before the illness had stolen her rosy cheeks. He's in here, she whispered. And she is too. They're my heart. They're why I keep going. Why I let men in expensive suits yell at me. Why I clean their toilets and take out their trash. It's all for her. In that moment, Julian Vance ceased to exist. There was only John, a man witnessing a courage so profound it shamed his entire existence. His wealth, his power, his empire. It was all meaningless, a pile of glittering dust compared to the love and resilience contained in that small, tarnished locket. He saw his own reflection in its polished surface, a coward who had lashed out at one of the strongest people he had ever met. You're a good mother, Elena, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Your daughter is lucky to have you. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she smiled, a genuine, heartbreakingly beautiful smile. Thank you, John, she said. Thank you for seeing that their bond was forged in that sterile break room, a fragile bridge of trust built between two lonely souls. For Julian, it was a turning point. This was no longer about assuaging his guilt. It was about fighting for her. He would not just fix the problem he created. He would dismantle the entire rotten system that allowed a woman like Elena to be so vulnerable in the first place. He now had a purpose far greater than any corporate merger. He would seek justice for Elena Hayes. His investigation deepened. As John, he heard the whispers in the hallways and break rooms. He learned of other cutbacks, of safety corners being cut. He heard how the cleaning solutions had been switched to a cheaper, harsher brand that left some of the older workers with persistent coughs and rashes. Using his own resources at night, he dug into Sterling Services Accounting, a company he owned but had never bothered to examine. What he found was more than just cruel cost-cutting. It was a complex web of deceit. He discovered a shell corporation, Trident Industrial Supplies, that had become Sterling's sole provider of cleaning materials 6 months ago. The prices were inflated, yet the products were substandard. The director of Trident was a name he didn't recognize, but the bank account the profits flowed into was based in the Cayman Islands. It took his forensic accountant less than an hour to slice through the firewalls. The account belonged to Marcus Thorne. It was a classic embezzlement scheme. Marcus was gutting the company from the inside, siphoning off millions while endangering the health of its employees, all to create the illusion of masterful cost-saving that would guarantee him a larger bonus after the Vanguard merger. And then came the most sickening revelation. The new, cheap chemicals from Trident contained a compound that was under review by the EPA for its link to autoimmune disorders, especially in children with prolonged exposure. Julian felt the blood run cold in his veins. He remembered what Elena had said about sometimes having to bring Maya with her on weekends when she couldn't find a sitter. Could Marcus's greed be the cause of her daughter's suffering? The possibility was a venomous serpent coiling in his stomach. The fight was no longer just for Elena's dignity. It was for her daughter's life. The stakes had been raised from personal injustice to something monstrous. He had to expose Marcus, but he had to do it in a way that would burn the entire corrupt structure to the ground. Simply firing him was a private solution for a public crime. This demanded a public reckoning. He began meticulously gathering the evidence. Bank statements, chemical analysis reports, sworn affidavits from other sick employees who he secretly compensated for their testimony. He was building a case not just for the board but for the world. But Marcus was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. He must have sensed a threat, an unknown variable in his perfect equation. His paranoia landed on the new janitor who seemed too observant, too quiet. He started watching John. He ran a background check, which, of course, came up as a carefully constructed fiction. Julian knew he was running out of time. He had to make his move before Marcus made his. He was too late. He arrived for his shift one evening to find the 24th floor swarming with building security and 2 uniformed police officers. They were standing by Elena's locker. Sal was wringing his hands, his face pale, and Elena was standing between the officers, her expression one of stunned disbelief. "I don't understand," she was saying, her voice trembling. "I've never seen that before in my life." On a nearby table lay a laptop computer, a high-end model from the executive suite upstairs. Marcus Thorne stood off to the side, his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for theft," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the floor. "The GPS tracker in the device led us right here, to her locker. It's an open and shut case." "I didn't do it," Elena cried, her eyes darting around wildly, searching for a friendly face. They landed on Julian. "John, you know me. Tell them." Before Julian could speak, one of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." They put her hands behind her back. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound Julian had ever heard. It was a sound of absolute defeat. She was being framed, publicly humiliated, and carted away like a common criminal. Her job was gone. Her reputation was destroyed. And with a criminal charge, she could lose custody of Maya. Marcus had made his move. He had taken Elena's greatest vulnerability, her poverty, her social invisibility, and weaponized it against her. He had neutralized the woman he had been harassing and, he likely thought, sent a powerful message to anyone else who might step out of line. As they led a sobbing Elena away, Marcus's eyes met Julian's. There was a flicker of triumph in them, a clear warning. "You're next." In that moment, all seemed lost. The evidence Julian had was digital, circumstantial. Marcus had created a physical, undeniable crime scene. The system was rigged in favor of men like Marcus, and it had just swallowed Elena whole. Julian stood there, frozen in his cheap gray uniform, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had tried to fix things quietly, from the inside, but he had only made things worse. He had underestimated his enemy's depravity. Now there was no more hiding, no more John Carter. The time for subtlety was over. It was time for Julian Vance to go to war. The annual Vance Industries shareholders meeting was the grand spectacle of the corporate calendar, held in the very same ballroom where the incident had occurred 2 weeks prior. The room was packed with investors, analysts, and the media, all waiting to hear Julian Vance speak about the landmark Vanguard merger. But Julian was nowhere to be seen. On stage, basking in the spotlight, was Marcus Thorne. He was delivering the preliminary report, his voice smooth and confident as he detailed a quarter of record-breaking efficiency and profit margins. Through a series of strategic and sometimes difficult cuts, Marcus purred into the microphone. "We have streamlined our operations and positioned Vance Industries for unprecedented growth. Our overhead is down 20%, a testament to a new era of fiscal responsibility." He was taking a victory lap, presenting his embezzlement as a corporate triumph. The audience was eating it up. The stock ticker projected on the massive screen behind him ticked upward. He was untouchable. Then, the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A figure stood silhouetted against the light of the hallway. A murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't Julian Vance in one of his impeccably tailored suits. The man who walked down the center aisle was wearing the simple, gray uniform of a janitor. It was Julian. He walked with a steady, determined pace, his eyes fixed on the stage, on the man whose smile was now frozen in a mask of confusion and dawning horror. He didn't stop at the steps. He walked right up onto the stage, taking the microphone from a stunned Marcus. The room was utterly silent. "There's been a change in the program," Julian said, his voice calm and clear, amplified throughout the cavernous hall. He turned to face the audience, the cameras, the world. "My COO, Mr. Thorne, speaks of fiscal responsibility. He speaks of difficult cuts. I'm here to tell you what those words really mean." He began to speak, and his confession held the room captive. He told them about the gala, about his own arrogance and cruelty. He told them about the slap, hiding nothing, excusing nothing. "I committed an act of inexcusable violence against an innocent woman," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "An act born of privilege and a profound disconnection from the humanity of the people who make this company run. Her name is Elena Hayes." He then spoke of his time as John Carter, of the things he had seen. He described the quiet dignity of the night shift workers, the people who were invisible to the executives in their corner offices. And then he turned his attention back to Marcus, whose face had gone ashen. "Mr. Thorne's record profits were not the result of genius," Julian announced, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "They were the result of theft. They were the result of poison." On the screen behind him, the stock ticker vanished, replaced by the logo of Trident Industrial Supplies. Then, a series of documents flashed across the screen. Bank statements from the Cayman Islands, internal memos, the chemical analysis of the cleaning supplies, and finally, the transfer of funds directly into an account bearing Marcus Thorne's name. Gasps and shouts erupted from the audience. "He has been embezzling millions," Julian declared, "while knowingly endangering the health of our employees with toxic chemicals. And when one of those employees, Elena Hayes, was targeted by his petty cruelty, he framed her for a crime to silence her." The doors at the back of the room opened again. This time, it was Elena who walked in, flanked by two of Julian's personal security guards. She was no longer in her uniform, but in a simple, elegant dress. She held her head high, her quiet strength radiating through the room. Standing beside her was a small girl with large, dark eyes, holding her mother's hand tightly. It was Maya. And to complete his victory, Julian's voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with contempt. He had Mrs. Hayes arrested, intending to leave her and her sick daughter with nothing. What he didn't count on, Julian's voice rose to a crescendo, is that we would fight back. At that moment, two uniformed police officers, the real ones this time, walked onto the stage. They moved past Julian and stopped on either side of the paralyzed Marcus Thorne. "Marcus Thorne," one of the officers said, his voice official and final, "you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and reckless endangerment." The click of the handcuffs was the closing punctuation on Marcus's career, his freedom, his entire life of lies. As they led him away, speechless and defeated, the ballroom erupted not in applause, but in a wave of stunned, awed silence. Julian Vance crossed the stage and stood before Elena. In front of everyone, he bowed his head. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice for her alone. "Elena, I am so profoundly sorry. For everything." The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Marcus Thorne's arrest was the lead story on every news channel. The tale of the billionaire who went undercover as a janitor to expose corruption in his own company became a legend. But for Julian, the public spectacle was merely the beginning. The real work started the next day. He liquidated Marcus's stolen assets and, adding a significant portion of his own fortune, established the Hayes Foundation for Employee Welfare. Its mission was simple: to provide comprehensive health care, emergency aid, and legal support to any employee of Vance Industries and its contractors. He appointed Elena Hayes as its executive director, giving her a budget that made her one of the most powerful philanthropists in the state. She accepted, not with gratitude, but with the solemn resolve of a woman who understood the weight of the responsibility. Her first act was to overhaul the contracts with all service providers, mandating the use of safe, eco-friendly materials and instituting a new, living wage for all janitorial and maintenance staff. She became their champion, their advocate, the woman who had walked in their shoes and now sat at the head of the table. Julian, for his part, began a radical transformation of Vance Industries. The Vanguard merger was completed, but on new terms. He insisted on a joint committee for workplace ethics, co-chaired by union representatives. He instituted company-wide profit sharing. He turned the top-floor executive dining room into a free, high-quality childcare center for all employees. He was no longer just an heir. He was a builder, constructing something new on the ashes of his father's cutthroat legacy. His relationship with Elena evolved from one of atonement to one of partnership. They worked side by side, their late nights in the boardroom a stark contrast to their first meetings in the sterile hallways of a silent office tower. He saw in her a wisdom and an integrity that humbled him daily. She saw in him a man genuinely trying to be better, a man shedding the skin of his former self. The cold, isolated billionaire was gone, replaced by a man who found more satisfaction in the opening of a new employee health clinic than in any corporate acquisition. He learned to listen. He learned to care. 1 year later, Julian stood with Elena on the balcony of a newly opened pediatric wing of the city hospital, a wing fully funded by the Hayes Foundation. Below them, a garden bloomed, a splash of vibrant life against the concrete of the city. Maya, her cheeks now rosy and full, her laughter bright and clear, ran through the flowers, chasing a butterfly. The new treatment, covered in full by the foundation, had worked a miracle. She was in remission. Elena watched her daughter, a serene smile on her face. She reached up and touched the silver locket that still rested at her throat. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think this was all I had left of my past, a memory of the love I lost." Julian stood beside her, not touching, but his presence a warm and steady comfort. "And now?" he asked. She turned to him, her dark eyes shining with a light he had never seen before. "Now," she said, "it reminds me that even after the worst storms, new things can grow. It reminds me of how a complete stranger showed me kindness with half a sandwich. It reminds me that a good man can be found in the most unexpected of places." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of their entire journey. It was a gesture of forgiveness, of partnership, of a future just beginning. Julian Vance looked out at the city, his city, that no longer felt like a cage but like a home. He had lost a fortune in setting things right, but he had gained something immeasurable. He had found his own humanity in the heart of a woman he had once tried to erase. True wealth, he finally understood, wasn't measured in stock portfolios or corporate towers. It was measured in the quiet dignity of a job well done, in the shared hope for a child's future, and in the profound, redemptive power of a second chance. What, after all, is the true value of a person? Is it the title on their door, or the integrity in their heart? Perhaps the greatest measure of a man is not how high he can climb, but how low he is willing to stoop